The 1980s Australian car market had more cars competing for more driveways than any previous decade, 10 of the ones that ended up in most of them, counting from 10 to 1. The one at the very top appeared in more Australian households than any Japanese car before it, without a race win, without a fleet contract, and without a headline anyone can name. That one is still ahead. Number 10. Holden Gemini, 1975 to 1984. By the early 1980s, the Gemini was showing its age against almost every measure the compact segment was using. The front-wheel drive Japanese hatchbacks had redesigned the comparison, and the Gemini's Isuzu-derived 1.6-liter four-cylinder and rear-wheel drive layout were engineering that had been current when the car was launched and were no longer leading it. The reason it remained in driveways through the early part of the decade was a specific one. It was the cheapest new Holden available. A family that wanted a Holden badge and couldn't reach Commodore money had the Gemini, and that position kept it on order books considerably longer than its competitiveness against the Japanese alternatives could justify. The buyers who chose it weren't making a careful comparison across the segment, they were making a brand decision within a price ceiling, and the Gemini was the only answer Holden gave them. Presence by budget rather than preference. The next car was there by genuine preference, aimed at a very specific kind of buyer. Number 9. Nissan Pulsar N12, 1983 to 1987. The N12 Pulsar arrived with a 1.5-liter four-cylinder and a front-wheel drive layout that, in 1983, was still a practical novelty in the compact segment for many Australian buyers accustomed to rear-wheel drive small cars as the default. What the Pulsar did throughout its production run was build that layout into an expectation through sheer accumulation. Buyers who drove one and found the interior packaging, the handling balance, and the economy credentials straightforwardly better than the rear drive alternatives at similar prices told people in adjacent driveways exactly that. The Pulsar never claimed the segment on any single dramatic measure. It claimed it by consistency, enough ownership experiences distributed through enough suburbs that the front-wheel drive hatchback became the template rather than the exception. The next car had been making a related argument through the preceding generation, backed by a different kind of evidence entirely. Number 8. Honda Civic, 1983 to 1987. The third-generation Civic in Australia came with 1.3 and 1.5-litre four-cylinders and a front-wheel drive hatchback body that was more composed than what it replaced, without making a dramatic announcement about it. What distributed the Civic through 1980s Australian driveways was not the specification, it was the service records of the generation before it. The buyer choosing a Civic in 1984 or 1985 was doing so because someone they trusted had owned the previous one and had a specific account to give: what it cost to service, how often it had required unscheduled attention, what the experience of running it across 5 years had actually produced. Those accounts were consistent, and they were circulating at the level of normal conversation in streets across the country. The domestic manufacturers could respond in advertising. They could not respond in the driveways, where those conversations were happening. The next car reached the buyer, for whom those conversations had already produced a firm conclusion about where to step up. Number 7. Toyota Camry V10, 1983 to 1987. The buyer the V10 Camry collected in Australia was a specific one. Someone who had run a Corolla through the late 1970s or early 1980s had formed a clear and durable view of what Japanese reliability actually meant across 5 or 6 years of ownership, and was ready to spend more than compact money without moving into Commodore or Falcon territory. The Camry owned that upgrade path with almost no competition. A 1.8-litre four-cylinder in the base specification and a 2.0-litre in the higher variants, at prices that sat neatly between what the compact segment asked and what the full-size domestic cars cost. The calculation was straightforward, and the buyers making it were numerous. Toyota's standing in Australian family car territory shifted during these years from reliable compact specialist to genuine family sedan alternative, and the V10 is where that shift became visible in volume. The next car was in every car park the compact segment reached, and was carrying a name it hadn't entirely earned. Number 6. Ford Laser, 1981 to 1990. Most buyers who drove a Ford Laser out of a dealer in the 1980s believed they were driving a Ford. They were driving a Mazda. The Laser across the KA, KB, KC and KE series was the Mazda 323. The same structure, the same engines, the same engineering approach, distributed through Ford's Australian dealer network under the Laser badge. Ford's corporate alliance with Mazda provided the car. Ford's brand standing provided the customer. The Falcon name had accumulated 20 years of credibility in Australian family motoring, and that credibility reached the compact showroom and did selling for a product the Broadmeadows plant had played no part in designing or building. The car was reliable because Mazda made it reliable. The car was present in every suburban street because Ford put it there. Both things were simultaneously true, and most buyers carrying Ford dealer paperwork home in 1986 or 1987 had no particular reason to examine either one. We are halfway through. From here, the cars on this list are the mainstream, the ones that filled the order books and kept the major manufacturers' factories running through the decade's middle years. The one at number 1 never appeared on a race program or in a dealer incentive campaign that changed anything. Still coming. Number 5. Mitsubishi Magna TM, 1985 to 1987. The Magna's specific distinction, one the launch communications made clearly, and that was genuinely accurate, was that it was the first front-wheel drive family car developed with substantial Australian engineering input, assembled at Tonsley Park in Adelaide. In 1985, that was a meaningful claim. The shift to front-wheel drive in the compact segment had been led entirely by imported cars. The Magna brought that layout to the family segment under a nameplate that could argue local credentials in a way the Pulsar and the Laser could not. The 2.6-litre Astron four-cylinder, a front-wheel drive platform, and a ride quality that gave the domestic family buyer something genuinely different from what the Commodore or Falcon offered. The first driveways filled quickly after launch. Reliability concerns with the Astron engine arrived later, in patterns service departments began to recognize across the country. The Magna's presence in the mid-decade was real and substantial. Its unqualified success was shorter than that presence suggested. The next car had a related story, higher volume, and a longer consequence. Number 4. Holden Camira JB to JE, 1982 to 1989. The Camira's ubiquity was purchased, in effect, by the Holden name, before any individual Camira had established a record of its own. Built at Elizabeth in South Australia on the GM car platform, with 1.6 and 1.8-litre four-cylinders and front-wheel drive, the car launched in 1982 as Holden's declared answer to the compact segment's front-wheel drive future. The name moved the cars. The warranty claims that followed, head gasket concerns, transmission issues, reliability patterns appearing at dealer service departments across the country arrived after the driveways were already occupied. A buyer standing at a Holden dealer in 1983 was purchasing on the strength of an accumulated brand relationship that the Camira's production quality was not consistently honoring. That specific gap, brand ahead of product, confidence ahead of evidence, is the Camira's particular place in this decade. The next car had the opposite situation, engineering that had earned its reputation across several preceding generations and delivered on it one more time. Number 3. Ford Falcon XF, 1984 to 1988. The XF's form of ubiquity was layered in a way nothing else on this list matched. Built at Broadmeadows in Victoria, with the 4.1-litre carburetted inline-six, proven, unglamorous, and reliable, the XF held its ground against the Commodore in family driveways without generating the decisive comparison that settled the Holden-Ford argument either way. What it also did was fill the institutional segment with a thoroughness the Commodore couldn't match. Government fleet tenders, taxi commissions in every state capital, rental car fleets at every major airport. By 1986, a domestic flight into Sydney or Melbourne was reliably followed by a rental counter with XF Falcons at the front of the queue. The XF was the car you drove when someone else had made the decision, a department, a hire company, a taxi operator. That institutional presence gave it a visibility the Commodore's stronger family purchase story didn't automatically generate. The next car had the family purchase story settled entirely in its favor. Number 2. Holden Commodore VK and VL, 1984 to 1988. What the VK and VL years accomplished specifically was completing the Commodore's replacement of the Kingswood in the collective Australian understanding of what a family Holden was. By 1984, the Commodore had been in production for 6 years. The VK arrived with the 308 cubic inch V8 across more of the range and a more resolved interior than the V8 it followed, and the Group A homologation program put 500 specifically built vehicles into private hands and connected the nameplate to touring car competition in ways that accumulated over the following years. The VL followed in 1986, with the Nissan RB30e Inline 6 replacing the Holden unit across most of the range, and the turbocharged RB30ET variant building its own independent performance reputation. Through both series, a buyer thinking about a family Holden wasn't thinking about the Kingswood anymore. They were thinking about a Commodore. That transition, the Commodore becoming the tradition rather than inheriting one, was completed in these years and hasn't been reversed since. The car at number 1 was completing a different kind of transition at the same time and has never reversed it either. Number 1. Toyota Corolla AE82, 1985 to 1989. The AE82 reached Australia with a 1.3 or 1.6-litre four-cylinder front-wheel drive across the range, and a build quality that represented a clear step forward from the generation it replaced. None of that was a surprise to the buyers who chose it. What the AE82 represented in the 1980s Australian market was the end of the period in which Japanese compact cars were competing for buyers willing to take a chance on something unfamiliar. By 1983, that buyer had already decided. The AE82's customer was a household returning from a previous Corolla, or a first-time buyer whose most trusted reference point was a neighbor who had run one without difficulty for 5 years and said so. The case for the AE82 was not being made in advertisements. It was being made in the driveways where the AE71 and the KE series before it had done their work quietly and completely. The domestic compact alternatives at comparable pricing needed to offer something the AE82 didn't, not merely match it, and in most comparisons they couldn't make that case convincingly. The AE82 ended the decade in more Australian driveways than any Japanese car before it, not because of any exceptional single year, but because the accumulated evidence of every preceding generation had made the decision straightforward for the buyers making it. That is a different kind of everywhere from anything else on this list, built on something no marketing campaign manufactures, and that no competitor reversed once it was established. These 10 represent the 1980s Australian car market in its most honest form, the institutional choices and the personal ones, the brand loyalties that held, and the ones the product couldn't support, and the steady accumulation of trust that the Japanese manufacturers had been building until, by the end of the decade, the conversation had changed in ways that the following years made unmistakable. Ordinary purchases made by ordinary people. The scale of them, added together, is what the 1980s actually looked like from the footpath. Which of these ended up in your driveway or your family's, and what did living with it actually teach you? Tell me in the comments. I read every one. And if Australian motoring history is what brought you here, a like and a subscribe to Sunburnt Chrome keeps it coming.